La siguiente expositora es Annelotte Crena de Longh, IDH Senior Program Manager Food Crops and Ingredients, con su intervención Introducción General a la Sostenibilidad y temas relevantes para el mercado europeo. Adelante, señora Annelotte.
Thank you so much, and thank you for introducing me. And also, I'm very honored to be here at this very interesting webinar amongst so many participants, and especially a set of very interesting speakers. So thank you for allowing me also to share a bit of my perspectives here today. I'm Annelotte Crena de Longh. I'm a senior program manager at IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative. So many of you already know my colleagues from IDH Colombia, but I'm positioned in another part of IDH, and I'll just share one. I hope you can all see my presentation slides here very shortly. So as IDH, we're working to accelerate sustainability in international supply chains, and part of that work is done in landscape, so very much in the different countries of production. But next to that, we also work among commodity supply chains, commodity platforms, and that is the area that I'm active in. I'm responsible for our commodity platform in fruit and vegetables. It's called Sustainability Initiative Fruit and Vegetables, and we shortly call it CFAV. And just a little bit of background about that platform. It was set up in 2012. Originally in the Netherlands, but then quickly growing with European retailers and traders. And here on the slide, you can see a little bit of the companies that have joined CFAV over the years. So these are many of the larger importers and retailers in Europe. Approximately this group collectively represents around 25% of the European import market from overseas imports. So also, of course, including produce from Colombia. This group of partners has joined up under CFAV to work on sustainability, driving the sustainability in their supply chain, working together with their supply chain partners to further improve sustainability of their produce. In the past years, main focus was on improving social sustainability, so especially through working with social standards to improve assurance of respecting human rights and good working conditions in the farms of that supplied all the produce coming into Europe. But in the past years, we've been working on an entirely new program, and this is quite an exciting time because we are kicking off that program early next month with, of course, many of the partners that you see here online. That program is not just only centered around social sustainability, and here on the right you can see what we are doing. So we're still working on improving working conditions, but next to that we will have more activities around living wages. All the companies that sign up to CFAV that are part of the platform agree to the ambitions that we set on each of these topics. Next to that, we also work on environmental sustainability, and especially on reducing the product environmental footprint. And actually, as a foundation to that, we work on supply chain due diligence, which is focused around creating better understanding of all the risks associated with the supply chains that the companies work with, and to ensure that these risks are addressed and that positive impact is created through their supply chains. So by working with this platform and by interacting with all the partners that we have within CFAV, but also outside, so I have luckily the possibility to speak to many of the European retailers and traders about their sustainability topics and their interests. yeah, I've been able to create a better understanding of what key sustainability themes and developments are within Europe, and that's what I wish to share in the rest of this presentation. So first of all, if you talk about sustainability from a European perspective, then the big question is, okay, why are companies talking about environmental or social sustainability or economic sustainability, and how is that agenda developed? And that's why I wanted to share this slide with you, to show a little bit about what are the great impacts or the influences into those agendas. And we'll make a little round, starting first here. Of course, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a great anchor. They have created a wonderful overview of the big issues that we face globally, and the ambitions that we set to tackle those issues. And they feed into the agendas of the retailers and the importers into Europe. It's an important anchor point. Companies want to show that they support these UN SDGs. But next to that, more concretely, in a European context, next to more general ambitions and focus on issues, there are also much more concrete expectations and policies, and increasingly also legislation around sustainability. And now I'm not talking about the more technical legislations about residue requirements, phytosanitary requirements, etc., but about more on a general level, environmental and social sustainability. And two elements that I want to highlight here is, first of all, that the EU, so that is most of the countries in Europe combined, have developed the Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy, which contains very specific ideas about how to reach sustainable agriculture and sustainable supply chains, sustainable agricultural supply chains. These contains elements around, of course, carbon climate change, but also around food loss and waste, about pesticide use, the importance of organic production, etc. Although this strategy is primarily oriented at European production, it also translates into the ambitions they have, or the requirements that they will increasingly set on product coming into Europe from other parts of the world. So that is an important set that companies, retailers and importers from Europe take into account when they think about and strategize about what they want about sustainability, what they need to have in place around sustainability, and how they communicate with their suppliers about that. Another part of that is legislation on supply chain due diligence. I will tell a little bit more about that going forward, but it is expected in the coming 2 years. There is no legislation at this point, but that at least not at an EU level, but there are expectations that there will be legislation on human rights due diligence in the supply chain, which requires from internationally operating companies to properly analyze their supply chains and look into potential risks regarding to human rights, but also to environmental impacts, and to address the found issues and risks, to ensure that these are remediated. So this is a requirement that requires these companies to much more detailed and critical look at their supply chains than they have done in the past years. So next to this, and now I'm going a little bit faster, of course, if you look at these companies' sustainability agenda, there's also consumers. In Europe, consumers are increasingly knowledgeable. They want to be informed, they are informed, they're also vocal. and they're interested to know about sustainability. That doesn't necessarily always mean that they will buy the most sustainable product if they have a choice. Price is also still a very essential part of shopping behavior, but it does feed into the sustainability agenda, and especially also about how companies communicate about sustainability. Then, of course, you have also civil society organizations, NGOs, that can either be a source of information and support for companies, but can also be watchdogs, highlighting issues with regards to fruit and veg production, and that companies can be very sensitive to those types of communications. One element that is definitely also very important is that investors and financial institutions increasingly set sustainability requirements before they invest in certain companies or want to finance certain investments. They include that in the risk profiles of companies, so it can really make a difference how sustainable companies are. And last but not least, of course, there's also definitely difference in how different retailers, for example, are positioned and how important sustainability is. So all these different elements weigh into how companies look at sustainability and what they also require from you as an exporter or as a grower. Now, before we go into very shortly the exact themes that we see as increasingly important in the coming years, I wanted to highlight these 4 elements that I think are overriding with regards to how sustainability is worked on. First of all, and I had already mentioned that, is the fact that companies are required to perform supply chain due diligence. So increasingly have more and more information on what is happening in their supply chain, where the product is not just where the product is coming from, but also about the working conditions and the environmental impact in those specific regions. And that is not just something that is managed through standards, but increasingly requires a dynamic flow of information. So that is the way they require data from their suppliers will change and will become more dynamic. Having said that, the next element that I wanted to highlight is that there's an increasing focus on sustainable products, especially if you look at retailers in the past year. There was, for example, a strong focus on reducing the climate impact of their retail stores or reducing the food loss and waste in their stores. But increasingly, they're looking at the entire supply chain as something that adds up to the sustainability of a specific product that they have in their supermarkets and they provide to their consumers. And not just is it important to be able to say this is a sustainable product or this is a product that is more sustainable than it was last year, but to be as concrete as possible on that, to really say, okay, this was the exact impact that this product has. And that is actually points 3 and 4 on this slide. So it's not just about beautiful stories about origins or about specific improvement projects, but it's about being much more data driven and having the information to clearly show and prove what the impact of a certain product was. So that means, you know, these 4 combined is that companies increasingly require more data from their entire supply chain. And that's not just at production level, it's also about their transport and about the warehousing, etc. But that is definitely a trend that we see and that will continue going forward to enable all that positive communication, again, to all these stakeholders that they work with. Compliance with the legislation, positive communication to consumers, interaction and showing that they're developing in the right way towards civil society organizations and financial institutions, etc. Luckily, what we also see is that since sustainability is so high on the agenda for many companies, and what we saw in the past years when, of course, COVID-19 struck, is that the topic remained equally important. There was no moving away from the topic. Most of the big retailers now have full-time teams specifically on these topics in place. They kept on working, and it remains on the top of the agenda. But since it's looked at from a more strategic perspective, understanding that many of the issues that we face globally are not something that is easily addressed or quickly addressed, that also means that there's a growing understanding that you need to have certain reciprocity in the supply chain. So really engaging with your whole supply chain to work on any topics or any issues that might be there or any challenges. And we feel also as IDH that is a key ingredient to really jointly work on sustainability. So maybe very quickly, I wanted to also show you what then the key themes are that we see both on the environmental and on the social groups of topics of sustainability. I will not go deeply into those because I know there will be many more very interesting speakers today who will share more insights on these topics. But when we look on the environmental side of the sustainability themes, a model that we always like to use is this one. It's, let me see, sorry, I'm accidentally switching slides. It's the planetary boundaries system, where you see what the key topics are on environmental sustainability. So that ranges from climate change to biosphere integrity, or in other words, biodiversity, land system change, freshwater use, and biochemical flows. That is related to phosphorus and nitrogen, so fertilizer use. So these are key topics that we call impact areas that are more and more on the agenda. Some underlying topics that are increasingly important and that I think are very relevant, and it's great that also it's not just in the producing countries themselves, but also across the supply chain. They're increasingly interested, for example, in soil health. And next to that, of course, food loss and waste is a very relevant topic across the supply chain, which is not just an issue at farm level, but equally in the retail stores themselves, and which is an important element, because when you look at environmental impact, the key way that companies look at that is at an environmental footprint of a product. So they look at a kilogram of whatever, mango, avocado, and say, well, what was the environmental impact of that kilogram of product? And then if half of that product is thrown away, then that actually doubles the environmental footprint of that product once it reaches the consumer. So that is how also food loss and waste is a very important element in that agenda. And then on the social side, and my colleague will definitely tell a lot about this later on, is that, of course, human rights, and specifically, of course, in our context, working conditions remain firmly on the agenda. Of course, this was already a key topic on the agenda in the past years, mainly worked on through the use of social standards. But then next to that, living wages has now really taken a big flight. It is something that almost all retailers in Europe are very interested in and have started working on. And then next to that, and very much related to the living wages topic, is of course the topic of living income. And the difference here is that we use the term living wages for employees, usually in larger farm settings, and living income is related to the income of the farmers themselves. That is actually what I wanted to share with you at this point. many of the themes in the past 2 slides will be discussed, I think, in more detail by other speakers today. Thank you so much for your interest, and please let me know if there are questions.
Muchas gracias, señora Annelotte. Si tenemos una pregunta, ya te la hago. What tools are already being used so that the end consumer is informed of the cause of the impact behind a certain product? Is there any type of seal that is put on the product?
Thank you very much for that question. And it's a good one. I think there are quite a few developments around that. Of course, there are certain standards that also require a certain level of environmental sustainability, and these can be communicated to the consumer, like the Rainforest Alliance seal, for example. But more generally, if you really look at impact topics like carbon footprint, etc., that is currently definitely under development. There is something called an eco score, and some similar ways of communicating to the consumer, but it's not yet completely institutionalized yet. I will be very interested to see in the coming years how this develops, but I know there are several retailers that are interested in communicating more transparently to the consumers the environmental impact of fruit and veg products. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por tu intervención y por tus respuestas.